Wireface is my hometown's urban legend. I was almost one of his first victims. It was the spring of 1992, and my roommates and I were heading out for a weekend camping trip in the woods. Our roommate, Brock, who was in the military, had to stay at the base late and said he'd meet us later that night. This wasn't great news for me and my other roommate, Cole. We'd had a massive fight earlier in the week where some painful truths were revealed, and we said things that couldn't be unsaid. We hadn't spoken since, and we were even avoiding eye contact, but we had to suck it up and carpool together. As I was giving my bags a final check, I heard Cole come back into the house and go to his room. I used the chance to go outside and load my bags into the car. I got into the driver's seat and lit a cigarette while I waited for him. Cole always moved at his own pace and had no respect for being on time. You know the type. His complete disregard for punctuality was what I hated most about him and was actually what caused our big fight. This situation was a perfect example. I wanted to be on the road by 8, and now it was 8:05, and we were still just sitting in the driveway. A few more minutes went by before I saw Cole's red hoodie in my side mirror. I heard him put his bags in the trunk, and then he got into the passenger seat. He had his hood up, his arms crossed tightly, and he was staring out the window, making a real effort to not even look in my direction. How childish, I thought, trying to keep my eyes on the road and pretending I didn't notice his passive aggressiveness. I still had a lot to say and was dying to let him have it, but I didn't want to start the weekend on a sour note. He's already living rent-free in my head, I thought. Don't give him the satisfaction. We somehow made it to the campsite without speaking or even looking at each other. The site was right off a fire road on a small hill leading down to the river. We were about 2 miles into the forest, so it was pretty isolated. Perfect if we got a little loud. We were meeting 4 of our friends, Mason, Clark, Marvin, and Stephanie, who I was especially excited to see. We had been close 4 years ago before she left for grad school. She ended up living there full time and planned to stay for good. I just found out the other day that she had moved back to town and would be at the campout. We hadn't talked in a long time, but I wanted to see if we could get some of that old spark back. I saw the glow of the fire and everyone sitting around it as my headlights lit up the campsite. I pulled up and waved as they started walking toward my car. As soon as I stopped, Cole threw the door open, got out, and didn't even bother to shut it as he stomped angrily toward the river. I tried to act like it didn't bother me, smiling as I got out of the car. "I guess you two are still getting a divorce?" Mason joked, walking up and giving me a quick high-five hug. I just shrugged. "He'll get over it," I replied, quickly changing the subject. I mentioned that Brock would be joining us later that night. Since there was only room for 2 cars, he'd have to park in a nearby lot and hike to the campsite. After greeting Clark and Marvin, the 4 of us chatted for a few minutes before Marvin went to catch up with Cole. I immediately noticed when Steph walked up to us and our eyes locked. She was a bit thinner and looked a little worn out, but she was no less beautiful. She still had that glowing aura, those same mysterious light green eyes, dark wavy hair, smooth silky skin, and a mesmerizing smile. We both let out a breathy before sharing an awkward hug. "You're back in town." I stammered, my nervousness obvious. Steph smiled and nodded. "Yeah, life's crazy sometimes," she replied. "One minute, you've got everything going for you. The next, you're wondering how much lower than rock bottom you can go." My eyes were drawn to Steph's bare arms, which had their share of cuts, scrapes, bruises, and what looked like puncture marks. I made no effort to hide my staring and frowned. My reaction was out of concern, not disgust, and I think Steph sensed it. "Everyone has their demons," I said, smiling and lightly taking her hands. "And how we fight those battles is what I think defines us." Steph smirked. You were always so philosophical, she said, giggling. I never forgot that about you. Sounds like we've got a lot to catch up on, I said, and she nodded in agreement. Steph told me why she left Boston. Apparently, she developed some addictive habits. The lab she worked at manufactured her substance of choice, which she started stealing. Eventually, she got caught. The university didn't press charges, but kicked her out of the program. Steph said she's back home now, weighing her options. Either finish her education or accept a simpler, inescapable life in our hometown. That wasn't there last time we saw each other, I said, pointing just above her left ankle, where there was a small, dark blue butterfly tattoo. You were always so observant, too, she remarked coyly. When did you get that? I asked while shutting the car door that Cole had left open. What's so fascinating about it? Steph quickly replied, playfully. I kept looking back and forth between Steph's vibrant face and the butterfly tattoo. I found it rather provocative, as if it signified a mysterious side of her that she'd either developed while away or had always had, and I was just now noticing it. It was definitely a side of her I wanted to explore more deeply, so this weekend was the perfect opportunity. So, you're not going to tell me? I asked, half joking, as I opened the trunk of my car. Then Steph screamed. The sheer terror in her voice physically shook me. Steph scrambled away from my car, pointing frantically at the trunk and dissolving into hysterics. When I looked inside, my body completely froze. Time seemed to stand still as I processed the gruesome scene. Cole's nude body was curled up on top of our bags. His eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of sheer shock. His neck was completely mangled, with blood seeping out and smeared across his limp body. In those first few seconds of seeing Cole's body, a deeply unnerving revelation hit me, making my stomach churn and sending sharp chills down my spine. If this was Cole crammed in the trunk, then who was in the car with me driving up? When I looked up from the trunk, I saw that everyone had gathered around my car. Steph was still hysterical, while Mason and Clark exchanged nervous whispers. The commotion even got Marvin's attention, and he came back up from the river. What the fuck is this, Cooper? Marvin asked loudly upon seeing Cole's body. Cole's dead. What did you do to him? Marvin violently shook his hands as he spoke, which made me notice something he was holding. Black sweatpants and a red hoodie. The same clothes the person who rode up here with me was wearing. I said nothing at first, especially after sensing the suspicion in Marvin's voice. He looked completely frazzled and was in a standoffish pose, as if trying to keep his distance. Everyone else looked similar. I turned to Stephanie, who was backed up against a tree, sobbing uncontrollably. When our eyes met, the raw terror in her face led me to an unsettling realization. It was me. They're all afraid of me. They think I did this to Cole. Wait, I said, slowly putting my hands up, which only put everyone more on edge. You think I actually did this to Cole? Why shouldn't we? Mason snapped back, visibly showing the sheathed knife on his belt. Given the circumstances, I knew the burden of proof was on me, and I had nothing to say that could immediately absolve me. I lowered my hands and kept them at my sides after Mason withdrew his knife. Mason was also in the military, and even though he no longer served, I didn't doubt his skills with the blade. So, what are we going to do? Marvin asked while slowly helping Steph back to her feet. Because there's someone else out there right now, so we have to do something quick. Let's do this, Mason said after a few seconds of silence, turning to Clark. Why don't you take Steph into town and get help? Marv and I will stay here with Cooper. You know I didn't do this to Cole, I blurted out. Mason looked at me sharply as everyone else headed toward Clark's truck. Don't tell me what I know and don't know right now. Mason snapped back, pointing toward the tree line. What were you and whoever the fuck that was gonna do? Bury him out here? Throw him in the river? Were we supposed to be next? This is ridiculous, I barked back, showing my frustration. I don't know who that was. I was already in the car before Cole. That other person even got in. I didn't even see him leave the house. We didn't say a word to each other the whole drive. I got my first good look at Cole's body as Mason responded to my remarks. I noticed barbed wire was tightly wrapped around his neck, digging deep into his flesh. The thought of dying in such a horrific way sent sharp chills down my spine and made me wonder how close I might have been to suffering the same gruesome fate. "Answer me," Mason barked loudly, snapping me out of my trance. "Did you guys plan this? Is this some sort of twisted game you sick fucks are playing?" Mason was relentless. Whether he was acting on instinct or out of fear, he had no doubt I had killed Cole. I was guilty until proven innocent, and I knew I needed more than just my word to be vindicated. "Wait," I heard Steph say as she walked up to us, still sniffling and visibly shaken. Cooper could be telling the truth. Everyone stared at Steph, bewildered. If whoever killed Cole just threw his body in the trunk and had those clothes on before getting in the car with Cooper, if they weren't even talking, he could have pulled this off without Cooper noticing anything. I nodded emphatically. "We weren't even looking at each other," I quickly added. Nobody said anything for about a minute. "Fuck it," Mason finally said. "Let's all just get out of here. Take Cooper with us. There are 4 of us and 1 of him. We have the numbers on our side." Mason walked up, grabbed me by the collar, and pushed me back against my car. "If you look like you're even thinking about trying something," Mason said fiercely, pressing the tip of his knife against my neck, "I'll take you the fuck out. I don't know what this is, but I'm scared, and I'm not trying to die. Maybe you didn't do anything, but right now, the facts don't look good for you." Mason made me walk in front of him and Steph, keeping my hands visible as we rejoined the others. Clark's truck was on, and he sat waiting for us in the driver's seat. Upon reaching the truck, Mason shoved me against it and thoroughly patted my pockets. After making sure I wasn't carrying anything dangerous, he grabbed me by my jacket and walked us around to the driver's side. "Change of plans," Mason said as he walked us up to Clark's roll-down window. "We're all just gonna get out of here. We need to take Cooper, but we're watching him, so you don't have to worry. Are you cool with that?" But Clark didn't respond. His head was pulled back and held in place on the headrest by strands of barbed wire that were tightly wrapped around his bloodied head and neck. Like Cole, the barbs dug deep into Clark's skin, almost cutting completely through his neck in some spots. Clark's hands were completely mangled, clearly from struggling to try and get free. Steph started screaming again, but not from the sight of Clark's mangled body. She was reacting to something in the woods. As Steph started backing away and frantically gesturing toward the tree line, I heard heavy, rhythmic footsteps coming from the direction she pointed, and I could just make out a vague figure moving in the shadows. Steph bolted from the truck and ran blindly into the forest. I looked back at Mason, who was just as terrified. I nudged Mason to snap him out of his shock, and he looked at me with a frenzied expression. "I don't know what this is," Mason gasped, looking between me and the approaching figure. "But I'm not fucking dying here." I then felt a sharp pain just above my hip and fell to my knees as Mason quickly fled in the same direction as Steph. When I saw Mason had his blade out, I looked down at my hands, which were pressed against where the pain came from, and saw they were coated in blood. I had been stabbed, I realized. Mason stabbed me. The wound didn't feel very deep, but it was bleeding pretty badly and hurt more with each passing second. I had no time to dwell on it, as the approaching figure's footsteps were getting louder. Pressing one hand against the wound, I got back on my feet and staggered toward the general direction Steph and Mason had fled. I wanted to make a break from my car, but I wouldn't make it in time without being seen. I had 2 choices: hide out in the woods until the coast was clear, or head to the river. which was only a few hundred yards from our campsite, and follow it back to the main road. No sooner had I entered the tree line, however, than I was bear hugged by something that brought me to the ground. They placed one hand over my mouth and held me firmly in place behind a cluster of trees and brush. "Shh," I heard Brock whisper. "Don't fucking move." A wave of relief swept over me when I realized it was Brock. Still pinned to the ground, I could see most of our campsite through a small opening in our cover. I watched the figure exit the tree line and got my first glimpse of Wireface. He wasn't particularly tall, maybe an inch or two under 6 feet. He had long, lanky arms and a slender but firm-looking physique. He wore a blue checkered plaid shirt, tattered gray overalls, and thick dark gloves and boots that were smeared with blood, dirt, and mud. He wore a beige burlap sack over his head, which was tightly wrapped in strands of barbed wire that had 2 small slits for him to see. Wireface slowly surveyed his surroundings before briefly re-entering the tree line. He pulled something squirming out of the forest and dragged it next to Clark's truck. It was Marvin. His hands and feet were hog-tied, and coils of barbed wire were tightly wrapped around his mouth. All he could do was writhe and make muffled cries that were well within earshot. Wireface grabbed a narrow metal pipe from the bed of Clark's truck, looking like he was debating what to do with Marvin. I feared the worst, but to my surprise, all Wireface did was set part of the pipe in the fire before re-entering the forest. Desperate to intervene, I tried wriggling free, but Brock kept me immobilized. "You're really that stupid," he hissed in my ear. "That's exactly what he wants us to do. He's using Marvin as bait. We can't just leave him." I quickly replied at a volume too loud for Brock's comfort, who clamped his hand over my mouth. "You trying to get us killed?" Brock snapped back. "Stay the fuck quiet." It was a waiting game. I felt just as helpless as Marvin, who could only writhe and twist on the ground. I don't know how long we stayed hunkered down, but enough time passed for me to notice the fire started dying. "Who was that?" I finally whispered to Brock, who soured at my ignorance. "Come on, you've heard the stories," Brock quietly replied. "Wireface. That's Wireface." My jaw dropped. "As in Landry Danes?" Brock nodded. "You all here tonight just got caught in the crossfire." "What do you mean?" I asked, turning to face Brock. Brock sighed. "It's me he's after." To explain, Brock launched into Wireface's backstory. His name was Landry Danes, a local kid our age who lived just outside of town. A few years ago, Landry was camping out here with some friends. The details were sketchy, but he supposedly got into a fight and fell face first into the campfire. Nothing was ever proven, but rumors spread that he was deliberately pushed or tripped. Landry survived, but he was hideously disfigured and wore a burlap sack to hide his face. Some kids bullied him about it, and even made a game of trying to rip the sack off his head to get a glimpse of his face. It drove Landry to wrap strands of barbed wire around his head, which is how he earned his nickname, Wireface. Then one night, Wireface attacked a group of kids in a nearby park. He didn't kill anyone, but he allegedly butchered one person so brutally that they supposedly begged to be killed. Landry vanished that night and was never caught. His family claimed they didn't know where he was, but many suspected they were hiding him on their property. 2 years later, the Danes' home was destroyed in a fire. No remains were found, and the family was never seen again, except for Wireface. Since then, some people around here claim they've encountered Wireface. He's been blamed for disappearances, cattle deaths, and even property damage, but it was all just speculation, or so we thought. I was living out of state when all this happened, but I had heard so many different versions of the story that I couldn't tell what was true. But one part of it still didn't make sense. Even after hearing Brock's clarified version, I still didn't understand why Wireface would be hunting him down. "This isn't the first time I've seen him," Brock whispered after a long, hesitant pause. "And I just knew Something was going to happen tonight. I narrowed my eyes at Brock. What do you mean, you knew? I asked sternly. And you didn't say anything. It's not that simple, Brock replied sharply. Who would take me seriously? Before I could ask anything else, I looked back at the campfire to get a visual on Marvin. He was still squirming, and his whimpers were compelling me to run out and save him, but Brock kept me in place. In retrospect, it's probably a good thing he did, because shortly after, Wireface reappeared. Marvin started twisting and whimpering, but Wireface paid no mind and walked right past him to the campfire. He stared into the flames for a few moments before retrieving the metal pipe he had previously placed in the fire. My stomach knotted when I saw the pipe's glowing red tip as Wireface turned toward Marvin. I made one last-ditch effort to spring loose, but Brock kept me firmly in place. Just look away, Brock whispered. There's nothing we can do for him. My view was partially obstructed, but I still watched as Wireface stood over Marvin and stuck the metal pipe's glowing red tip in his eye. A crackly, high-pitched hiss rang out as Marvin began to thrash wildly and release a barrage of muffled, agonizing screams. Wireface was twisting the pipe in his hands as he slowly pushed it deeper into Marvin's ocular cavity, clearly trying to prolong his death and inflict the most pain possible.
Come on, we gotta go now,
Brock whispered as he pulled me away from the macabre scene. My truck's at the lot. We'll get there quicker if we follow the river. Steph and Mason are still out there, I replied, trying to ignore Marvin's muffled screams and the pulsating pain that erupted from my stab wound when I started moving. I saw what Mason did to you, he replied. They think you killed Cole? Do you trust them to trust you? I gave a weak nod as Brock started to pull me away, moving deeper into the woods. And with him poking around here, Brock continued, he'll get to us first before we find anyone. Let's just get help. Heck, maybe they wound up following the river too. I reluctantly went along with Brock, who made some good points. Maybe I should just focus on getting to safety, I thought. Why should I go out of my way to save someone who, just moments earlier, showed he had no problem taking my life? These thoughts filled my head as we moved through the woods at a painstakingly slow pace. In a way, I guess that was a good thing, because it kept the pain from my stab wound at ease. It felt like hours, but we finally heard the rushing water of the river. I was eager to reach the riverbank, but Brock put a heavy hand on my shoulder. We're not out of the woods yet, Brock said quickly. Short distances can be deceiving. He pointed just a few feet in front of us, where the moonlight shone on a strand of barbed wire tied between two trees, just a few inches above the ground. If Brock hadn't pointed it out, I surely would have tripped over it and fallen into a few more strands of barbed wire that were set at varying heights in front of the tripwire. Before I could say anything, something grabbed Brock and spun him around, just as I spotted its movement in the corner of my eye. It then got in between us and shoved me to the ground. I lay hunched over on my side, pressing my hand over the stab wound, but was quickly turned onto my back and saw the tip of Mason's blade just inches from my face. Mason, relax, Brock said quickly, walking up to him and placing a hand on Mason's outstretched arm holding the knife. He killed Cole, Mason replied, keeping his eyes fixed on me, even while lowering the arm holding the knife. They have to be in this together. No, Brock said softly. He just used him to get to us. Brock pulled Mason away, which gave me some time to collect myself and wait for the pain from my stab wound to subside. At first, all I heard were their whispered murmurs, but then Brock and Mason began to argue. While trying to regain my composure, I only caught a few phrases from their exchange. Brock telling Mason he didn't have to do that, to me, and Mason saying something along the lines of not knowing who to trust. While slowly sitting up, it was something Mason said to Brock. We're here because of you. that I found peculiar and caught my attention. I tried to get back on my feet when something struck the side of my head, sending a sharp, burning streak across the left side of my face. The impact threw me back to the ground, from which I could feel, without having to see for myself, that blood was spilling from the left side of my face. As my vision readjusted while I slowly sat up, the first thing I saw was Wireface walk past me and close in on Brock and Mason. I didn't expect what happened next. As soon as Brock saw Wireface closing in, he grabbed Mason by the collar and practically threw him toward Wireface in a single motion before scurrying off into the woods. As he fled, Brock began manically screaming phrases like, "Not me," and "I'm not dying." Mason stumbled into Wireface but tried to push himself off him and took a blind swing. Wireface effortlessly thwarted the attempted attack, grabbed Mason by his collar, and head-butted him twice with his barbed-wired face. The two strikes littered Mason's face with cuts and punctures that bled profusely. He seemed stunned by Wireface's two bashes, who then took his free hand, pressed it against Mason's face, and started violently twisting it in a grinding windshield wiper-like motion. Mason started screaming in sheer agony and thrashed wildly, appearing totally helpless to break free of Wireface's grasp. I picked up sounds of ripping and scraping, which is when I realized the hand Wireface was mashing Mason's face with was wrapped in barbed wire. I watched in horror as Wireface then grabbed Mason's shirt with both his hands and threw him into the tripwire he set up, causing Mason to fall and get entangled in the other strands of barbed wire he had woven between the trees. Despite some blood getting in my eyes, I got back on my feet just as Wireface began looking between me and Mason, whose body twisted and flailed as he released some of the most horrible, blood-curdling shrieks I've ever heard. How could Brock do that? I thought while waiting for my fight-or-flight instincts to kick in, they were best friends. I thought they'd both take a bullet for each other without thinking twice. How could Brock turn on someone like that so quickly? Use them as an escape decoy? My train of thought was interrupted when Wireface began stepping in my direction. Fuck it, I thought before turning and sprinting toward the river. Mason's screams persisted, ringing throughout the woods as I ran, sending sharp chills down my spine and twisting my stomach into tight knots. Maybe Brock had the right idea. Why risk my life for someone who showed no regard for mine, someone who literally stabbed me earlier tonight? And what about Brock, I thought? Can I even trust him after what he just did to Mason? Would he do the same to me if he had a chance? While contemplating these thoughts, I inadvertently stumbled down an embankment that brought me to the river, coming to a halt on the muddy bank. I lay semi-coiled in a ball, gritting my teeth from the sharp burning that came from the stab wound. After the pain became manageable, I slowly crawled toward the river shore to wash my face. The left side burned when I applied water to it, and I could feel the lacerations Wireface made when he struck me with that same hand he wrapped in barbed wire. I was able to walk, but the pain coming from my stab wound every time I took a step or a deep breath was excruciating. I didn't see any footprints along the riverbank, making me wonder what became of Brock. Stephanie was still out there too, I thought, stopping in my tracks. Should I go back and find her? The pulsating pain from my stab wound prompted me to quickly dismiss the thought. The rain started as a light drizzle and quickly turned into an all-out downpour. Despite being injured and soaked to the bone, I continued following the river and eventually reached the lot. I walked up to Brock's pickup, which was the only car there, and peered inside to see it was unoccupied. Brock's truck was locked, so in light of the circumstances, I smashed the driver's window with a rock to get inside. I felt around the driver's side visor, where I knew Brock kept a spare key. After finding it and starting the car, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. 3 deep gashes and about a half-dozen puncture marks ran across the front and left side of my face. I was lucky to get away with just that, unable to even fathom the horrific ways the others met their demise. I had a few other scrapes, cuts, and bruises, but my biggest concern was the stab wound, which still seethed with pain. I sped out of the lot and onto the dirt road. It was still pouring, and even with the windshield wipers on, it was difficult to see clearly. While rounding a bend, I noticed something standing in the road. The flashes of its plaid shirt and brownish beige overalls were all I needed to know it was Wireface. Gripping the steering wheel, I didn't hesitate to stomp on the accelerator and plowed right into him. His limp upper torso slammed onto the truck's hood before getting sucked under and turned into a speed bump. After feeling the entire car run over him, I slammed on the brakes and stared at Wireface's battered body in my side view mirror. I waited several minutes before stepping out of the truck. I probably should have kept driving, but I wanted to confirm he was actually dead. Another part of me hoped he was taking his last breaths so I could observe his final moments with my own eyes. A brown burlap sack was over his head. He wore a tattered plaid shirt that was blue and green and dark gray overalls. His limbs were bent and twisted in different directions, which is when I noticed both his feet were missing. They looked like they were literally torn off his legs. And when I turned toward the spot where he had stood, I saw 2 fleshy stumps protruding from a pair of shoes situated in the center of the road. Moving away from the body, I squinted in bewilderment as a strong uneasiness began to materialize. I realized tight strands of barbed wire ran across the road and were tightly wrapped around the severed feet, holding them in place. One of them also had a subtle detail that made me begin to physically tremble. Just above the left foot's ankle was a small dark blue butterfly tattoo. No, I murmured, feeling panic unravel as I scrambled back toward the body and pulled the burlap sack off its head. My fears were confirmed when I found myself staring into Steph's lifeless eyes. The sight sent sharp pain shooting from my stab wound, and I fell to my knees, sobbing her name. Her mouth hung agape, frozen mid-scream, as if trying to say, "Stop!" It was an accident, I thought. Anyone else would have done the same thing. How could I have known? She looked just like him. That's when I noticed the clothes and the burlap sack she wore, while similar, didn't identically match Wireface's attire. There was nothing I could do now, I thought, and slowly stood back up, trying not to disturb my stab wound. I kissed my hand and was about to place it on Steph's forehead when I spotted something emerge from the tree line. It was Wireface. He just stood there in the pouring rain, seeming to both taunt me and revel in my reaction to running over Stephanie. A knotty queasiness formed in my stomach, and before he had a chance to get any closer, I listened to my instincts and scrambled back into Brock's truck. I caught one last fleeting image of Wireface in the rearview mirror, who stood along the road, canting his head and watching as I sped away in the pouring rain. The rest of the night was a blur. My stab wound was apparently much worse than I thought. I lost a lot of blood and had to be hospitalized. The police eventually cleared me as a suspect, but a few on the force still weren't convinced. The police discovered 4 bodies and conducted a thorough sweep of the woods, but they found no trace of our attacker. It wasn't in the official report, but the bodies were supposedly found seated around the campfire, held in upright, lifelike poses with an intricate entanglement of barbed wire. Circumstantially, the evidence was there, but police had nothing physical to officially declare these killings were the work of Landry Danes. I want to say this was my only encounter with Wireface. However, it's not where my story ends. Although I barely escaped being one of Wireface's first victims, it was unbeknownst to me that his reign of terror had only just begun.